Summer sky hangs over a wide Norwegian valley. The air is bright and sharp. Farmers stand in long lines with spears and axes. Across from them, a smaller band gathers around a red banner stitched with a cross. In the middle, a king prays by a flat stone. He touches the earth, then draws the sign of the cross on his chest. His name is Olav Haraldsson, Olav the king to his men, a troublemaker to his enemies, and to later centuries, Saint Olav. What happens next will be sung about in halls and whispered in churches for 1,000 years. People will say that on this day, 29th of July 1030, Norway became Christian. But is that true? Can a whole country change in a single clash of shields? Or is the story more complicated, more human, than a single thunderclap moment? This is the story of the Battle of Stiklestad, the fears and hopes that led to it, the lives it cut short, and the long shadow it cast over law, worship, and the very idea of Norway. To understand Stiklestad, we need to see the country as it was before the swords were drawn. Norway in the early 1000s was not one neat kingdom with a single voice. It was a patchwork, long coasts and deep fjords, farms carved into harsh land, and powerful families who guarded their rights with pride. The old gods were still named: Odin, Thor, Freya, and their stories lived in poetry and custom. But Christianity had arrived along trade routes and royal courts. Merchants met monks, kings met bishops, and the cross stood beside the hammer. Norway had felt the Christian pull before Olav Haraldsson. Håkon the Good, a king in the 900s raised in England, tried to bring in the new faith but met strong resistance. Later, Olaf Tryggvason pushed harder, and churches began to appear. Some people accepted baptism. Others bent under royal pressure, then drifted back to old ways. The land was not a blank slate waiting for one king's signature. It was a living mix, old and new, shore and mountain, clan and crown. Into this mix stepped Olav Haraldsson, born around 995. As a young man, he fought abroad, as many Norsemen did, learning the ways of war and the wider world. He returned to Norway around 1015 and moved quickly. He won the Battle of Nesjar in 1016, shaping the balance of power. Olaf was not just a fighter. He wanted order and law. He also wanted Christian worship to be more than a court fashion. He built alliances with churchmen. He listened to Bishop Grimkel, an English bishop working in Norway. Olaf's court began to look different. Priests at the king's side, churches supported with royal resources, and new rules that pressed the country toward one faith. Was it simple? No. Many chieftains resented outside authority, whether from a king or a bishop. Yet Olaf kept pushing, not only with force but with law. He wanted Norway to be one realm with one set of rules, not a quilt of personal deals. In his vision, Christianity and kingship supported one another. The law of God and the law of the king working together to tame feuds and steady the land. At the Assembly of Moster, traditionally dated to 1024, Olaf and Bishop Grimkel framed Christian law for the realm. The point was not only worship, it was life. Rules about Sunday rest, marriage, burial, and behavior set the rhythm of communities. By binding these to king's law, Olaf gave the church a legal backbone. He did not just say believe. He said, this is how we will live. For many, this was welcome. Christian customs often brought protections for the weak, a steady calendar, and courts that tried to limit revenge. For others, it felt like a foreign net thrown over free men. Local leaders saw a king allied with priests trying to set terms in their homes. Some had personal grudges. Some had old gods in their hearts. Some simply wanted to keep power. Resistance grew. While Olaf tried to shape Norway, another giant was moving. Cnut the Great, king of Denmark and England, and a master of northern politics. Cnut wanted Norway under his influence. He used gold, marriages, and promises to bring Norwegian nobles to his side. He did not need to fight every battle if he could turn key men. Olaf felt the circle tighten. By 1028, Cnut's pressure and the work of Olaf's enemies forced Olaf out. He went east to the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kievan Rus, what is now around Novgorod and Kyiv, seeking shelter, allies, and time. Exile is a hard teacher. In foreign halls, Olaf looked back at the country he had tried to rule and change. He had made laws, he had built churches, he had pushed stubborn men and wounded pride. He had also stirred faith and hope among many. But the map did not bend the way he wanted. From the east he planned to return, hoping to gather support in Sweden and along the borderlands, and to win back his throne. and with it, his project of a Christian Norway under one crown. In 1030, Olaf made his move. With a modest force, faithful companions, some hired men, some hopeful locals, he crossed from Sweden into Norway. His path took him over forested heights and down into valleys. Toward the north lay Trøndelag and the town of Nidaros, modern Trondheim, a place of great importance. The route funneled him into the Verdal Valley, where the land opens into fields and farms. It is here, near the place called Stiklestad, that his path met a wall. Olaf's enemies had not been idle. Word traveled fast, and a great levy had been raised. Farmers and local leaders who did not want the king back, at least not on his old terms. The Bonde Hæren, the farmers' army, stood in his way. It was not a neat division of pagans versus Christians. Many on both sides had been baptized. The lines were drawn more by power, debt, and pride than by pure theology. Still, Olaf's men saw themselves as fighting for a Christian order, and they said so out loud. At the head of the levy stood figures whose names echo in the sagas: Kálfr Árnason, Thorir Hund, and Horek of Cnut. Each had his reasons. Kálfr Árnason came from a strong family and had been close to Olaf but turned away. Thorir Hund of Hålogaland had a deep blood feud with Olaf after the killing of his kinsman. Horek of Cnut guarded the power of the north. Around them gathered many who feared the loss of local rights under a hard king. Some had been courted by Knut's envoys. Some had stories to settle. When such motives join, numbers grow. It is important to be honest. Our detailed knowledge of Stiklestad comes mostly from sagas written generations later. They blend memory, politics, and poetry. So when we hear the speeches, the cries, and the exact blows, we should hold them with a light grip. But the broad shape is clear enough. A king returned, a country divided, and a decisive fight in a farmed valley under a pale sky. The morning was likely cool. A summer sun rose over crops and fences. The field was not empty land, it was someone's livelihood. Men tightened straps and checked spearheads. Banners lifted. On one side, the farmer army stretched wide, more numerous, a wall of shields. On the other, Olaf's smaller band arranged in compact lines, the king's standard, a cross standing out. The noise of a field like this is not cinematic, it is busy and practical. Leather creaking, murmured prayers, last jokes, the click of metal, a cough, a memory. We are told that Olaf spoke to his men, encouraging them to stand fast and trust God. His followers were not only warriors, some were boys, some were older men who could not let their king face his enemies without them. In the levy too, there were fathers and sons. Stiklestad was not a distant battlefield, it was the middle of a community. That is part of why it became so important later. It was not only about crowns, it was about neighbors. When the lines moved, the ground shook. The sagas give us a cry from Olaf's side. Fram, men Kristnir, men Krossens, men Konungs. Forward, men of Christ, men of the cross, men of the king. From the levy came their response, rough and proud. The two fronts slammed together, shield to shield. In that era, fighting was close and physical. A good shield could save a life. A broken one meant terror. Men tried to push, break, and spill the enemy's line. Spears found gaps. Axes reached over the top. Time warped into a blur of effort and fear. For a while, it seems, Olaf's men held and even pressed. A small, determined force can punch above its weight in a tight space, but numbers count. The levy found ways to fold the king's line. There were islands of struggle where a banner stood and men clung to it. Names rose and fell. A standard bearer dead, a friend lost in the press, a cousin seen for a second across the gap. The moment of the king's fall is described with ritual weight in the sources. We hear of 3 wounds delivered by 3 men, almost like the strokes of a bell. One blow cut his leg, some say by Thorstein Narismed, a shipwright known for his strength. Another blow struck his neck, often linked to Kálfr Árnason, who once had ties to Olaf. The final, fatal thrust pierced beneath the king's mail, attributed to Thorir Hund, with a spear or knife pushed under the ringed armor. The exact order and tools vary by telling, but the meaning is clear. The king who had tried to bind the country under one faith and law fell under the hands of those who resisted him. We should not pretend that the battlefield stopped to watch. Men around Olaf died with him. Others fought on, not yet knowing the banner was lost. Somewhere, a teenager froze, then ran. Somewhere, an old fighter laughed tight in his throat as he swung one more time. But news moves like lightning in a close fight. When the king's standard dipped and the word spread, courage on his side crumbled. The levy surged. Stiklestad belonged to the farmers and their leaders. When a fight ends, the world becomes too quiet. The clang and roar stop, and you can hear the wind again. People look for friends and find them still. Widows are made in 1 hour. At Stiklestad, the fallen lay among trampled crops. The survivors on the levy side would have gone home with stories. Some proud, some shaken. Those close to the king carried a different burden. They gathered his body and tried to keep it safe. According to tradition, Olaf's remains were hidden first, then later moved to Nidaros. It is here that the story begins to shift from politics to something more mysterious. Reports of wonders began to cluster around the dead king. People spoke of healings, of changes of heart, of a sense of holy presence near his resting place. Bishop Grimkel returned to guide the church. Within a year, 1031, Olaf was honored as a saint. This was not a slow burn, it was a flash. The king defeated in life became a powerful figure in death. Why did this happen? Partly because Olaf's project spoke to the longings of many. He had tried to use law to calm feuds and give structure to life. He had linked that effort to Christian teaching. After his fall, people could remember the hope without feeling the pressure. A martyr is easier to love than a demanding ruler. The stories of his courage and piety fit a pattern the medieval church knew well. A ruler who suffers for a just cause and whose death becomes a sign from God. There was also a political truth. The cult of a royal saint is a powerful glue. It gathers people around a shrine, a festival day, and a shared memory. It turns a person into a symbol that can bridge divides. In the years after Stiklestad, that is what happened in Norway. The place of the king's death became hallowed ground. The church that rose at Stiklestad, by tradition built where he fell, claimed the Olav's stone beneath its altar. And in Nidaros, where his body was enshrined, a great cathedral would eventually grow, drawing pilgrims along paths that still exist today. The immediate victors at Stiklestad had removed a rival, but they had not erased his vision. Christianity continued to take root, not only because kings insisted, but because people found in it order, meaning, and hope. The church in Norway developed a structure of bishops and parishes. Christian law guided courts and marriage. The great day of remembrance, Olsak, St. Olav's Day, fixed on July 29th, kept the story alive each year in services, fairs, and plays. The shrine at Nidaros became a northern beacon. Pilgrims traveled to the tomb seeking healing and help. Craftsmen, merchants, and priests gathered near it. Over time, saints' stories become part of a people's self-understanding. Who we are, what we honor, what we believe about suffering and justice. St. Olav's cult did that for Norway. It fed art and song. It informed how kings spoke about their role, not only as rulers but as servants of something higher. Even those who once opposed Olaf could visit and kneel. The altar has a way of absorbing enemies. There is a human thread to tie here. Among those on Olaf's side at Stiklestad was his half-brother, a young man named Harald Sigurdsson. He was wounded and fled east, beginning a life of wild adventures as a mercenary and commander far from home. He would return years later to rule as Harald Hardrada, Harald the Hard Ruler, one of the most famous kings of Norway. His path crossed empires and ended in battle at Stamford Bridge in 1066. In his story, we see how Stiklestad sent ripples through people as well as institutions. The battle marked bodies and set courses. The country's history bent around that moment. So was 29th July 1030 the day Norway became Christian? If by that we mean a clean switch, like sunrise after night, then no. The process was long and full of back and forth. Christian teaching had been present for decades. Many Norwegians were baptized before Stiklestad. Others still kept old customs afterward. The timeline is messy because people are messy. But if we mean a symbol, a shared story that focuses the change, then yes, Stiklestad became that day. It offered a powerful narrative. A king tried to bring the faith in a just law. He fell to resistance, and in falling, he rose as a saint whose memory completed what his sword could not. The martyr's shrine did what armies could not do. It pulled hearts toward a new center. Over the next generations, Norway's Christian identity solidified, and the law knit together with the church's teaching. In that sense, the day Norway became Christian was not a precise clock tick. but a banner hung over a season, and Stiklestad wrote the banner's words. It is healthy to keep our eyes open about sources. Much of what we know comes from later saga writers who loved drama and meaning. They arrange events to teach as well as to record. That does not make the core false, but it reminds us to separate the hard backbone of events from the softer tissue of speeches, numbers, and miracles. Historians dig through these texts with care, comparing versions, weighing motives, and listening for the ring of truth. Yet even if some details blur, the shape stands. Olaf fell. A cult rose. The law and the church grew together. Festivals and churches fixed the story into the year and the land. A stone in a valley became a place to pray. A cathedral far to the west drew strangers into one line, and a country that once felt like many little worlds started to think of itself as one. If you go to Stiklestad today, you find more than a signpost. You find a church that carries the tale in its stones. You find a cultural center that tells the story with care. Each summer, people gather for plays that reimagine the day when a king fell and a saint rose. Families come for festivals around Olsak, and the valley fills again with voices. This time not cries of battle but songs and lines of dialogue. Pilgrim routes that lead to Nidaros still see feet and prayer. There is a sense that the past is not a locked room but a path we keep walking, seeing new things each time. It is easy to talk about kings as if they were only symbols, but Olaf was a person. He could be hard, and he could be kind. He made enemies when he pressed too hard. He made friends who would follow him into a storm. He tried to weld a scattered land into a realm, and to tie that realm to a church. He failed in one way, then succeeded in another no one could have planned. His blood flowed into the earth of Stiklestad, and that ground became holy to many. To stand there is to be reminded that history is both steel and prayer, law and story. What does Stiklestad teach us? First, that change usually comes through both power and persuasion, and that neither is enough alone. Olaf used law and force. After his death, story and devotion carried the rest. Second, that defeat can become a seed. The crown fell in the field and the cult rose in the church. Third, that nations are made not only by treaties and taxes, but by shared memories. When people keep one day together, year after year, the day begins to shape them. It also teaches humility about historical labels. To say the day Norway became Christian is a story-shaped sentence. It captures something true, the power of that moment, while hiding the long work before and after. Good history lets both stand, the moment and the long path. Before we close, let's look briefly at the three names often linked to Olaf's fall. Kálfr Árnason had once fought alongside Olaf, but turned, perhaps out of calculation, perhaps out of grievance. He later found himself pulled into the orbit of Olaf's memory, a reminder that the saint's light fell on friends and foes alike. Thorir Hund, fierce and proud, bore the wound of a blood feud. In the old code, honor demanded satisfaction. He is the one most often credited with the fatal thrust. Horek of Cnut guarded northern independence with stubborn care. These were not cartoon villains. They were complex men in a hard world, defending their interests, their pride, and their sense of justice. Seeing them clearly keeps the story human. On Olaf's side were men who believed he could bring order and godliness. Some were drawn by personal loyalty, others by faith, others by the hope of a Norway that could stand among Christian kingdoms with laws that limited the bloody swing of feuds. The field at Stiklestad held all of that in one place. That is why the story never lets go. One of the most important parts of Olaf's legacy is the shape of law he helped set. Christian rules about marriage, Sabbath, and the protection of the vulnerable began to structure daily life. Assemblies judged disputes not only by custom, but by a written sense of right and wrong that came from church teaching, as well as older practice. Over time, this helped soften old cycles of revenge. The church brought schools and writing. Kings found in Christian kingship a way to speak of justice that went beyond personal power. And ordinary people slowly came to see the year through a Christian calendar. Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Saints' Days, woven into the seasons of fishing and farming. It did not happen overnight. It did not happen without conflict. But after Stiklestad, the tide favored this direction. A shrine in Nidaros worked on hearts. A law, shaped by Christian thought, worked on habits. Between them, they changed the country more thoroughly than any single battle could. What shall we say about the miracles reported at Olaf's tomb? People in the 11th and 12th centuries took such reports seriously. Stories of healing and answered prayers spread the fame of a saint and pulled pilgrims across mountains and seas. Modern listeners may be skeptical, but even skepticism can acknowledge the social power of belief. Whether one sees a miracle as divine action or as the fruit of hope and attention, the effect on the community was real. People gathered, gave, celebrated, and found a common center. That center helped the church build, teach, and care, and it fixed the memory of the king's sacrifice into the land itself. Stiklestad also mattered beyond Norway. In the north, kingdoms were forming across the old Viking world. Denmark and England were bound under Cnut. Sweden was finding its shape. Christianity was the language of diplomacy and alliance. A Norway with a royal saint and a church rooted in law and land could stand in this network with more confidence. Pilgrims and priests exchanged news and learning. Kings married into foreign houses. The image of Saint Olav, sword in hand, cross on his banner, traveled in art and seal. Identity hardened into a form that could be recognized from abroad. Even today, the story of Stiklestad shapes how people talk about faith and nation in Norway. It is part of school lessons, local pride, and national ceremonies. The St. Olav drama and festivals keep the memory active. Pilgrim ways to Nidaros give modern walkers a way to pray with their feet. Churches named for St. Olav stand in many towns. Debates about church and state still echo, but the tone is quieter. The old fight between king and chieftains has turned into conversations about freedom and community, tradition and change. History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme, and Stiklestad is one of the rhymes in Norway's song. Let's hold the balance one last time. On one side, a real battle in 1030, a king killed by countrymen, immediate political victory for his foes. On the other, the near-immediate rise of a saint's cult, the deepening of Christian law and life, and the long-term shaping of national identity around a martyred king. Both are true. The sword won the day, the shrine won the century. That is why people still speak about Stiklestad with a kind of reverence. It was defeat and victory at once. Return, in your mind, to that summer morning. The stone in the field is just a stone, warmed by a thin sun. A king kneels there and whispers a prayer. Around him, men shift their shields and swallow hard. Across the field, farmers grip their spears and think of home. A horn sounds. The lines move. In an hour, the stone will be slick with a king's blood. In a year, people will kneel by another stone in Nidaros and whisper his name as a saint. In a century, a nation will build its greatest church above his shrine. In 1,000 years, the valley will still tell the story. Did Norway become Christian in a day? No, people do not change that way. But there are days when a country sees itself clearly and chooses a story to live by. Stiklestad was such a day. One king fell and a symbol rose. And in the echo of that symbol, law, worship, memory, and hope, Norway found a shape that has lasted to this day. Thank you for walking this battlefield with me. If this story opened a window into Norway's past, join me next time as we follow the road from shrine to law. How the memory of St. Olav shaped art, justice, and kingship for centuries. If you enjoyed this video, and be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next.